A few years ago, the international food prices increased dramatically. Over a very short period of time, less than 2 years, the rice prices tripled. In fact, that happened over a few months. The maize prices went up quite dramatically, so did the wheat prices, and so on. That brought out a number of doomsayers, a number of apocalypse prophets. Said, see, we have been telling you all along that we are headed in the wrong direction and the world end is near. As far as food is concerned, we're all going to be short on food. We're tearing down the natural resources, and climate change is going to help us come to a very unfortunate end as far as the food situation is concerned. I want to start out by talking a bit about the extent to which that is likely to be true. So here's the first question. Is the world facing an impending food apocalypse? And there are a number of reasons that I want to go through why this may be so. Close to 1 billion people, probably 1 in 7, maybe 1 in 8 world citizens don't get enough to eat. They suffer from hunger, from malnutrition, and from related human misery. That hasn't really changed much, or didn't change much until the rapid increases in food prices, at which point the number probably increased, and I'll come back and talk about that. But we've had a very large number of people who simply did not have access to food. To them, the apocalypse is not a future scenario. 5 million preschool children die every year from hunger and nutrition-related problems. So they have been in this kind of a situation for a very long time. At the same time, we have almost the same number of people who are overweight, obese, and suffer from related chronic diseases. And that, to a very large extent, is a problem of high-income countries, but it's increasingly becoming a problem of low-income countries as well. In the United States, 2/3 of the population of a little more than 300 million are either overweight or obese, and among those people, half of them are obese, and many of them suffer from diabetes, from a number of other chronic diseases. So we got the two extremes taking place, and certainly the number of overweight and obese people is going up quite dramatically, particularly among low-income people in high-income countries, and also among low-income people in middle-income developing countries. There is a very serious dietary transition taking place, particularly in middle and high-income developing countries, where people are shifting from more traditional diets, high in fiber, a cereal-based diet, a root crop-based diet, a cassava diet, or a potato diet, towards animal products-based diet with lots of meat, lots of dairy products, and processed foods that is, in many cases, is very high in refined sugar and fat. That transition, of course, contributes to the overweight and obesity problem, but it also contributes to the availability of food because there is a rapid increase in the demand for feed for the animals that we so desire. And I should say, I'm going to show some other, talk a bit more about some other aspects of this. And I want to assure you that I'm not a vegetarian. I have no hidden agenda of coming down hard on meat consumption. I'm just trying to show some trends. The population keeps growing. We are probably about 6.8 billion people today in the world. And over the next 40 years, that population is going to grow by about 40%. So by 2050, we will be a little more than 9 billion people. The question is, can the world feed 9 billion people? Yes is my answer. No is the answer of the doomsayers. Increasing demand for biofuel when the oil prices went up to about $150 a barrel. Biofuel suddenly became of great interest, and certainly the United States, the EU, and a number of other countries moved towards using some of the resources, some of the land and other resources that have been used for food production, moving those into the production of raw material for biofuel, maize for ethanol production, for example, soybeans, oil palm, and a few other things for biodiesel. In Canada, there was quite a movement towards using rapeseed for biofuel production, and so on. So that again, of course, had an impact on the availability of food. Increasing water scarcity. This is something that Australia has felt over the last few years with the droughts. Water scarcity is also a serious problem in many developing countries, and I think we are moving slowly but surely in the direction of having to increase the price that farmers pay for water in order to improve efficiency. About 70%, maybe 75% of the world's water resources are being used in agriculture, and of course a lot of it is being recycled, but quite a bit is being lost into the seas and therefore ending up as containing salt. And one of the reasons why this water is being used very inefficiently in agriculture, and it is in most countries, is that it is, if not free, then at least not being costed at the level, not being valued at the level that it probably should be. So we need to look at that. But I'm going to come back at that because and talk some more about that, because that's an issue with some of the other natural resources as well, that they are being overused and misused because the cost of using them does not measure up to the scarcity value. Soil degradation, again, is another issue that contributes to a potentially bad future food situation. Climate change will help us make matters worse, and I'll talk some more about that as well. There is a movement now from middle income developing countries and international corporations to move into low income countries and take control or try to get control over land, which they would then use to produce either food or raw material for biofuel, and under the total control of the middle income country or the private corporations that participate in this. They are, of course, not taking over this land by force. They are entering into agreements with governments, particularly in some of the African countries. Ethiopia, for example, is advertising availability of land, and investors from middle-income countries and private corporations are flying over the country, deciding which parts of the country they would like to have. They then go and talk with the government, and the government said, that's fine, we will make a deal with you because there's nobody living on that land anyway, which is not true in most cases. Actually, there are lots of small farmers in those areas, and we don't know quite yet what's going to happen to them because this is a fairly recent phenomenon. And then, of course, we have the global food crisis, which I already referred to. Some people think we're still in crisis, others think that we're out of it. But basically what it is, it was a rapid increase in food prices, as I mentioned, and a subsequent decrease to price levels that are still considerably above what they were 10 years ago. And I'll show you some figures, some pictures of that. Up until the increase in the international food prices, the number of hungry people stayed roughly constant at about 800 million, as shown in red in this slide. We then took a green pencil and extrapolated that straight line to 2015, and of course if you extrapolate a straight line, that is what you get. And we picked 2015 because that's the end year for the World Food Summit goal, which was agreed upon by virtually every country in the world in 1996 at a meeting at the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. The agreement was to reduce by half the number of hungry people that existed in 1990. Now this shows 1991 as the starting point because we take a 3-year average. That's a detail that we probably don't need to worry about. So the blue line shows what should have happened, what countries agreed to. And of course the red line shows what actually happened, and the green line shows what would happen with business as usual. Situation is considerably worse in sub-Saharan Africa, where you see the red line going up, and again, if we extrapolate that to 2015, we're not going to get anywhere close to reducing by half the number of hungry people in that region. In fact, it's going to go up quite dramatically. Let me come back and say a few things about what happened to the world food price, or the global food price, or the international food price, whichever term you wish to use. If you look at the top line, which is red, that line represents the real food price over a period of time. And the spike that you see, the first spike was for 1974. And then the second spike is the one we experienced in 2007 and beginning of 2008. So one of the messages from this picture is that the food prices didn't go up in real terms, that is, adjusted for price inflation. The food prices didn't go up nearly as much this time as they did in 1974. But if you look at the nominal prices, which is the bottom line, then of course the nominal prices did go up. So what really happened was that during the 80s, which is within this inside this circle, or I guess it's an oval if we want to be specific about it. During that period of time, the real food prices dropped dramatically for a number of reasons. One important reason was the existence of food subsidies and trade distortions coming out of the United States and the European Union and a few other countries, something that this country has fought and to try to get a freer market for grains. But partly because of that, and also because of the Green Revolution being so successful in increasing productivity, the food prices dropped to levels that were unreasonably low by the end of the century. That is, 10 years ago, the food prices were really too low to justify production. And because of that, governments in most developing countries did not invest in agriculture. It was much cheaper to import food than to invest in rural areas, to build roads and make the markets work, and to help farmers get access to technology, to crop varieties. These things weren't really prioritized by developing countries, with a few exceptions, because the prices were so low. Investments were not made by farmers either, because the farmers couldn't make enough money to set aside money for investment. So that's kind of what started. That was the forerunner for the rapid increases in food prices, which we see within this oval or this circle. Now, what happened there, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about why the food prices increased, because I think that's generally known. But if you want me to talk more about that, we have time after I stop talking in the Q&A, so we can talk about that. But what's very clear is that the food prices didn't go up solely because we were short on food. There were so many other things that entered in. Policies were made that pushed prices up. Investments were made. Huge sums of money were moved from, for example, the housing market in the United States into commodity markets. And there were a number of other reasons why the prices went up as fast and as much as they did. Then, of course, prices came back down. Whether you want to call that a price spike or a price bubble is up to you. But the fact, of course, is that the prices went way too high, and, of course, they came back down. One of the reasons they came back down is that farmers are better economists than most economists. When the prices go up, they produce more. They respond to increasing prices. We've had bumper harvest of grain the last couple of years. We're probably going to have an even bigger harvest this year. Again, it depends a lot on what happens to the weather over the next few months, but it looks like farmers have really responded by increasing food production. That, of course, will drive down prices. This one I'm going to skip because I'm not quite sure I have all the numbers straight on that, and in any case it just tells the same story, that one for wheat. Wheat prices went up and came back down. But I do want to talk about this one because that illustrates the importance of government policies in setting food prices at the international market. At the time the rice prices went up, they tripled over a few months as shown in this slide. We had more rice in the world than we ever had before. There was no shortage of rice. What happened was, and I'm trying to illustrate that on the slide, I hope you can see it in the back. What happened was that some of the major exporter of rice decided to restrict and in some cases stop exports in order to protect their own domestic rice prices. That meant that what was available in the international market was much less than before, and therefore the rice importers were now forced to pay a lot more for rice. Thailand and the United States, being major exporters as well, did not put in restrictions. So they were being good. But they'd also paid to be good, because when the prices went up, they offered their rice, of course, at these much higher prices, and both countries made tremendous amounts of money continuing to export rice within this period when the rice prices were so high. And again, there's a very interesting story as to why India chose to stop rice export when they did. But again, it may be more detailed than we have time to go into. The conclusion by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization was that because of these price increases, we now had many more poor people than we had, many more hungry people than we had before, and this is shown at the top of the red line here. I simply added the last few years to what I showed you before, and you see a dramatic increase in the number of hungry people from about 850 or so to more than a million to more than 1 billion. In the case of Africa, you see the same kind of increase in the number of hungry people. I don't believe those numbers. I really don't think those numbers are correct, and I'll try to explain why that is. First of all, when the international prices went up, as shown in this one for rice, the top line is the international rice price as reflected by prices in a major exporter, namely Thailand. The rice prices in most developing countries did not go up that much. In other words, the transmission of the changing international prices to the national markets was very low. And that's due to for two reasons. One, some countries who are closely integrated in the international market put in place policies to protect their own domestic markets. I already talked about India. That was true for several other countries as well. And then there was another group of countries that have such poor infrastructure where the markets really don't work, the institutions don't work, and therefore the international prices, they were not really linked in with the international market to begin with. So there were two sets of countries where the price transmission was very low. Now, if the price transmission is low, poor people in those countries are not going to be affected as much by increasing international prices as if the price transmission was high, obviously. So therefore, to argue that when the international prices go up, many more people are going to suffer is based on the assumption that you have a high transmission of the international prices into the national ones. This is another picture showing, again, the very big difference between what happened internationally and what happened in a certain number of countries. I'm only showing 3 or 4 countries here, but you can kind of go through the countries and you'll see a very similar picture, both for rice and for maize. I'm showing this for maize. This one is particularly interesting because if you look at the red line, the top line, that shows what happened to maize prices in Kenya. And they did go up with the international maize price increase, but they never came back down. And what's happening here is that in many, it's not just Kenya, in many low-income countries, including many in sub-Saharan Africa, there are domestic reasons why the food prices went up that have very little to do with international prices. And that's why we have to be really careful when we look at the international food market and then conclude on that basis that what's happening in the individual countries. In Kenya, for example, like you had in this country, Kenya suffered from drought over an extended period of time, and there were some other problems. They had some armed conflict, as you, I'm sure, are well aware. And so there were a number of reasons why the prices behaved quite differently in that country. So what did governments do? Well, governments, in response to these price increases, governments in most countries did what governments do, namely try to protect themselves. They want to maintain the legitimacy. They don't want to be exposed to excessive criticism. They might lose their power, or something may happen that they don't like. So what governments did when prices did go up, they put in place very short-term measures, price controls, kind of taking the market price formation out of the picture so that they kept prices low. Now, you can only do that for a short period of time. It's going to be very costly to maintain artificially low prices. They did a number of other short-term measures. The other thing they did was that I should also mention that the emphasis was on short-term transfer to the urban population. And remember that 70% or so of the people who suffer from hunger are in rural areas. They are poor people living in rural areas, depending at least in part on agriculture. Many of them are net buyers of food. They simply can't produce enough to feed their own families. But those that were a threat to the governments of these countries were not the rural poor. They were too busy trying to survive, and they couldn't really form coalitions. So the food riots that we heard so much about were really riots of urban people, and frequently not the poorest urban people, the lower middle income classes in urban areas who saw their food prices go up. They took to the streets, often not just because of the food price, often for political reasons. There were a number of other reasons. In Haiti, for example, the drug traders were paying demonstrators to go on the street and demonstrate against high food prices, and there was a minister in the government in Haiti that was trying to get a handle on the drug trade coming in from Latin America, going to the U.S., and the drug traders were paying people to ask that this minister be fired, basically, be taken out, not because he had anything to do with food prices, but because he had a lot to do with drug trade. So this is just an illustration that the food price increases were used as an excuse for doing riots, maybe on other things. So the rural poor were basically left to their own devices because they were not a threat to the government. The exception is China. In China, the government is very concerned about what's happening in rural areas, and they are paying a lot of attention to what's going on in rural areas, including, when necessary, increasing subsidies to farmers and doing a number of other things to keep the situation under control. The other thing that governments did was at least talk about expanding food production, and in some cases they actually did manage to invest more in rural areas. And then the land grabbing, in other words, taking control over or buying control over land in other countries, came into that picture. Basically, what some of the governments are trying to do now is to become closer to self-sufficient in food, so they don't have to depend as much on import. And that is shown in this slide, which shows the buildup of food stocks, of reserve stocks, if you like. And I'm not going to go through the numbers, but there have been quite dramatic increases in the amount of food set aside for, if you like, a rainy day, no pun intended, but set food aside so that they have more control over the food supply, particularly countries like the Philippines that depend so much on rice imports. The government was extremely nervous during this period of time when rice prices went up, because their future, the government's future, may well depend on what happens to rice prices governments have lost power because the rice prices went up at the wrong time in the election cycle. So for whatever reason, many governments are trying to build up stock. This shows the buildup of stock in China, and the amount of grain in stock in China is a state secret, but there is some leakage of the state secret, and it looks like China is building up huge grain stocks, maybe as large as covering more than half of the annual supply. In fact, what I'm showing here is that it's closer to 70%. But we don't know for sure. But what we do know is that there has been a dramatic buildup of stock in China. Similarly, in India, where the data are a little easier to get hold of, you see a dramatic increase in both rice and wheat stock. When those warehouses are full, you're going to see a lot more grain released on the market, and that's going to push down grain prices, at least for a short period of time.